Lagiacrus is a teal coloured leviathan with orange spikes and is the first Thunder Element flagship monster. He is also the first and so far only flagship monster capable of fighting underwater, being introduced in MHTri. Lagiacrus in Tri is introduced to players through a surprise encounter, where he shows up in a quest that you are not expecting him to. He is initially fought underwater and eventually on land, and during hunts he can switch between the two. On land, Lagiacrus can shoot thunderball projectiles. He can swing his head around, curling up to send his tail swinging behind him. He can slam his body into the ground and zoom at you. Simply moving against you will deal damage, and he has a double bite at close range too. He also has a hip check which, with his size, can be difficult to avoid. When underwater, he can flick his tail at you from below. He can chain thunderballs together, and he has underwater variations of his land attacks. They can be more dangerous down here, because they have the opportunity to hit at more angles, plus Lagiacrus can execute them faster. His biggest addition underwater though, is the ability to make use of his shell shockers. Those spikes on his back can be charged with electricity only in the ocean, and when this happens, not only are existing attacks charged with electricity, but he can perform powerful area of effect blasts that force you away. This, combined with his mobility increase, can make him a genuine challenge. The shell shockers can only be used underwater, and when fully broken, disables all his thunder attacks. Their position on his back makes for an interesting dynamic. On land, hitting them is only possible when we knock him to the ground, as they're simply too high on his back. Underwater combat allows for 360-degree movement, which means that we can simply swim up to them and get free hits. In the Monster Hunter series, now more than ever, we're often faced with monsters that can change their movesets on the fly, unlocking new abilities that make them more dangerous, and you either have to wait for them to reverse on their own, or knock them out of it. Technically, Lagiacrus is the first case of this, being a monster who can fight on land with one type of moveset, and then go underwater, becoming more dangerous. What makes him even more threatening is that fighting underwater is harder than it is on land for us, while he can move around much more easily. Roughly a year or so later, Monster Hunter Portable 3rd released for the PSP in Japan. This was an original game that reused maps and monsters from Tri, but a huge difference was that it didn't have underwater combat, being land only like every other game. Regarding the two underwater maps in Tri, the deserted island had those specific areas closed off, and the flooded forest had been dried up. These were locations that Lagiacrus could previously reside in, and he was excluded from Portable 3rd entirely. As we've established, Lagiacrus was designed with both land and water combat in mind, and it would seem that without one, the Portable 3rd developers did not think it was worth including him. In Tri, he doesn't really leave the water areas unless he absolutely has to. For example, in the deserted island, the furthest he'll go on land is Area 5. He is more of a water monster than a land one. Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate came out sometime later for the 3DS and Wii U. This game is essentially Monster Hunter Tri, but incorporating content from Portable 3rd and with new G-Rank content. This means that Lagiacrus is back in this game, with some G-Rank additions. The main difference is that Lagiacrus can hip check twice in a row when underwater. Introduced in high rank, and also fightable in G rank, is the subspecies Ivory Lagiacrus, an ivory covered leviathan with blue spikes. He is a lot bigger than the standard Lagiacrus, and has a very key difference. Ivory is much more adapted to land, and spends much more time there than underwater. Ivory can use his shell shockers on land, which is something the standard Lagiacrus cannot do, so by default, all the previously exclusive underwater thunder attacks can freely be used here. In addition to his thunder projectiles, he can fire a larger one that rapidly explodes on the ground. Being a land-based Lagiacrus, he also hangs out in areas of the deserted island that Lagiacrus never visits, same with the flooded forest. Ivory is capable of underwater combat too, sharing the same attacks with underwater Lagiacrus in high and G rank. 3 Ultimate also has a G rank exclusive rare species called Abyssal Lagiacrus that resides in the boss arena known as the Underwater Ruin. He is dark blue, and his shell shockers are always active, causing his entire body to glow with electricity. This is a very old Lagiacrus, who has grown so big that he can't live on land anymore. All of his thunder attacks are massively enhanced. He is even bigger than Ivory, which makes his physical attacks possess even more danger. He also has the ability to create 3 large whirlpools that last for a few minutes, and can drain your stamina upon contact. He can shoot Ivory's enhanced thunder projectiles too. You may have noticed that underwater combat plays a fairly substantial role in all Lagiacrus fights. Even Ivory will sometimes fight down there. Lagiacrus himself was cut from the only 3rd generation game to not have underwater combat. None of the Lagiacruses returned for Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, neither did underwater combat, which itself has never returned to the series. But Lagiacrus was brought back in Generations, being fought exclusively on land. The deserted island from Tri was also brought back to this game, identical in structure to how it was in Portable 3rd. Lagiacrus can now travel in the same area as Ivory used to. He can even be fought in the Misty Peaks, which wasn't the case in 3 Ultimate. For the first time ever, Lagiacrus fights exclusively on land. What has essentially happened is that he now has an expanded version of Ivory's moveset, as he can use his shell shockers on land and make use of even more thunder attacks. Lagiacrus can fire thunder projectiles that land on the ground and create a hazard in the form of pure lightning. When enraged, his area of effect can cause lightning bolts to appear in multiple locations. He can create a series of thunderballs that rapidly rotate around him, serving as another hazard. He can also charge up a thunder projectile that explodes into several thunder blasts. Not only that, he can launch a supercharged area of effect that also explodes into multiple blasts. He still has all of his physical attacks from Tri and 3 Ultimate, but they can be charged with thunder, just like they would when he used to fight underwater. Lagiacrus will often appear to travel underwater when he moves between areas too. In G rank, his thunder line can be doubled up, and he can perform a new thunder bite that is often comboed from other physical attacks like a charge. Lagiacrus is not in Monster Hunter World, or Rise, or any of the expansions, nor are his variations. It was later revealed that not only was he supposed to be in World, but they tried to put him in the other 5th generation entries too, but were ultimately unable to. And the reason for this is Lagiacrus's body structure. In World, the maps often have varied terrain with slopes and hills and ledges everywhere, and monsters are coded to have their bodies adapt so it doesn't look like they're floating. The issue with Lagiacrus is that when he moves around, his whole body stays on the ground. Belly, legs and tail, and having to make them all adapt to the terrain was just too much for the hardware the games were running on. Monster Hunter Rise featured the return of Leviathan Mizetsune and introduced newcomers Almudron and Somnicanth. These Leviathans function properly because their bodies and tails are raised slightly above the ground, therefore limiting the contact they make with it. For Lagiacrus to make a return, this issue would have to be fixed. I have complicated feelings on Lagiacrus. Some of you might recall a video I made some time ago where I called the Generations version bad, as underwater combat was what made Lagiacrus unique, and nothing in this game really replaced it. This is still true, but one thing I noticed is that on land, in terms of moving around, he simply turns to face you and moves forward. But when underwater, he can move around you at different angles, giving him more directions to attack from. I do think this contributes to him being harder underwater. Now I think Lagiacrus is kind of bad in Generations, but I don't think it means bringing him back for future games without underwater is a bad idea. The developers for Generations were tasked with bringing back quite a lot of monsters, many of whom were older than Lagiacrus, and so they couldn't really give him the time he needed to be a really good fight, and this is kind of why he ended up as a glorified Kezu. When fighting Mizetsune and Almudron and Rise, I noticed just how agile they are. Even on land they can strafe and leap and attack from multiple angles. I feel as if updating Lagiacrus to maybe not be as agile as this, but have more movement options would be a really good idea. He's quite similar to the Royal Ludroth in terms of moveset, and that thing is honestly a beast in Master Rank. Having a larger, faster version with advanced thunder attacks could still be a big threat. I believe my favourite Lagiacrus is probably Ivory. He has a great design, fights mostly on land, but isn't completely underwater free, so he can be a lot of fun. Some people might be curious as to my thoughts on underwater combat and whether it should come back. I made a video on that some time ago as well, and I highly recommend you check that out. It is 50 minutes long, but I do break down the system in its entirety, so it's worth checking out, especially if you're unfamiliar with the topic. Which Lagiacrus is your favourite? Do you want underwater combat back? Let me know in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.